Pagan resentment. When the gospel of Jesus Christ penetrates a community dominated by evil, Christians should expect persecution. Here's Dr. Gene Getz.
The gospel penetrated the evil that was happening in Ephesus. When Paul came, taught the word, ministered there in the school of Tyrannus, week after week, for 2 full years, people came to Christ, and what happened? As a result of the penetration of the gospel in that pagan city, there was pagan resentment. There was persecution. And so consequently, we need to think about that principle because it's true. It applies even to us today in certain ways. We'll talk about that in the application. But notice the spiritual success that Paul had. And many who had become believers came confessing and disclosing their practices, while many of those who had practiced magic collected their books and burned them in front of everyone. So they calculated their value and found it to be 50,000 pieces of silver. In this way, the word of the Lord flourished and prevailed. This was a bonfire, a huge bonfire on probably the main streets of Ephesus. At one point in time, I calculated the value of 50,000 pieces of silver in today's economy. Back then, I calculated it was worth $5 million. These books, these scrolls. Think about that. Probably more today in our economy. All going up in smoke. Now what happened is that pagan resentment was strong because the gospel was penetrating this evil place. And we read about this in verse 23 of Acts 19. About that time there was a major disturbance about the way. And by the way probably refers back to what Jesus said when he said, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. And so the gospel and those who follow the gospel, they called it the way. So there was resentment, great disturbance about the way. For a person named Demetrius, a silversmith who made silver shrines of Artemis, provided a great deal of business for the craftsmen. This was a huge business. Imagine. It wasn't only for the people in Ephesus, and that was huge, but from people all over Asia. When they came, they would buy these little idols and make them a part of their life. And so he got these craftsmen together, and when he had assembled them as well as the workers engaged in this type of business, he said, men, you know that our prosperity is derived from this business. We're making a killing here. You see in here that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this man Paul has persuaded and misled a considerable number of people by saying that gods made by hands are not gods. In other words, these were the people from those other cities in Asia that are mentioned in the book of Revelation. It's impacting the business in all these other places because of people who are coming to Christ because of the ministry in the school of Tyrannus. And so he continued his disturbing lecture to these men. Not only do we run a risk that our business may be discredited, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis may be despised and her magnificence come to the verge of ruin, the very one all of Asia and the world worship. And that's not an exaggeration because of the definition of the world at that time. My wife and I were in one of the 10 cities called the Decapolis. And that's way back in Israel. That's across the Jordan to the east. And in one of those 10 cities, we saw the temple of Artemis still standing. So when it says Paul's words are impacting people all over the world, this was literally not just in Ephesus and Asia, but as far away as Israel, what we call the land of Israel today, and across into what is called Jordan. So this was making a tremendous impact. And so consequently, what happened? A riot. And it The words of Luke tell it like it is. When they had heard this, they were filled with rage. Now, by the way, this silversmith was very cunning because he said, not only are we going to lose our business, which could come across as being rather selfish and self-serving, he brings religion into it, and he said, and this is going to destroy our religion. This is going to destroy the worship of Artemis. That was shrewd, because that's what brought the rage. And we read about it. They were filled with rage. They began to cry out, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. You see, what they responded to was his statement about this is going to impact our religion. So the city was filled with confusion. They rushed all together into the amphitheater, which, by the way, could seat about 25,000 people. And they rushed together into this amphitheater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, who were Paul's traveling companions. And although Paul wanted to go in before the people, the disciples did not let him go in, and probably saved his life. Because if he had gone into that theater, he could have been killed. They could have stoned him, they could have killed him. And he left Ephesus and then went on and continued his third journey, and we'll read about that in the future. But you know, that theater, there it is, been excavated today. And I remember standing on that platform right down there in the center, and a group of people, and we began to sing, How Great Thou Art, in that amphitheater. How great thou art. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made. That sounds like Paul's message on Mars Hill when he was revealing to them who the true God was, not the God of stones. I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. And I remember there were some people that were sitting up in those stands around in that amphitheater, and the sound rung out from those of us who were singing it, and they began to join in, coming to the chorus. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art. And when I think of God, his Son not sparing, sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. How great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art, how great thou art. What a thrill it was to stand in that very amphitheater and worship the one true God. Not the gods of wood and stone, not Artemis. And so here's a question for application. In our particular cultural situations, what are some of the ways Christian values may bring persecution from those who resent the power of the gospel to change lives? Now, the fact of the matter is that this is a very unique situation, very unusual in terms of economy. In our particular culture, in some respects, the fact that we are Christians and committed Christian values is really one of the reasons we have a great economy. It's just the opposite. Christian values from the very beginning of our culture has really helped build the economy in our culture. Quite different from what happened in Ephesus. But the fact of the matter is that more and more as believers, we're going to face anger and resentment because of our values that are out of harmony with idolatrous values, worldly values, and that's idolatry. Because anything that is worshipped other than God is idolatry. And today, our values are in direct opposition to a lot of secular values. Now, in our society today, thank the Lord that they're not out to kill us. But if you ever watch some of the shows at night, today it's more at the humor level, making fun of us. people who believe in the values of the Bible, particularly our moral values. You know, how stupid can we be? When are we going to grow up? When are we going to mature? Don't you realize that's all old-fashioned? So today it's at the humor level, jokes. We see a lot of that. But the fact is that more and more as we move away from God's values, we're going to suffer more and more persecution. I believe the Bible prophesies that. And we need to be prepared for that. And we need to think about this principle that we have from this passage. When the gospel of Jesus Christ penetrates a community dominated by evil, Christians should expect persecution. In fact, Paul said, as he was about to die for the cause of Christ in that dungeon where he would be removed and beheaded, in his last letter to Timothy, he said, all who live godly in this life will face persecution at one level or another. But thank God, the promises that he gives us. And we've seen this illustrated in the lives of people in other cultures today who are literally dying because of their faith in Jesus Christ, knowing and believing the words of Jesus, who said, I will never leave you or forsake you.